Oregon was once settled thoroughly by people of the First Nations, and in fact was not called Oregon then. It had many names and many different borders, each determined by the native nations that had lived there for centuries. It was only when settlers from the eastern United States migrated west and began to explore that region that a place called Oregon, as we know it today, began to exist. The Geer family was one of the many families that crossed the continent on the Oregon Trail, a perilous 2,000-mile journey to a place that was completely unknown to them, except by word of mouth. They landed in Oregon Territory in 1847, where they claimed a square mile of land and became the source of many future generations of people who would call themselves Oregonians. These children were born into a quickly changing landscape and charged with the opportunity and the burden of deciding the course of politics, art, and culture of a new state. Though thousands of men and women would help shape what it means to be an Oregonian, 3 members of the Geer family would play a significant role in this story. And the ripples of their lives would affect the fabric of Oregon history. The first governor of Oregon to be born in this new landscape was a journalist and farmer named Theodore Thurston Geer. On his 60th birthday, T.T. Geer began writing his autobiography. He had been born in Oregon in 1851, the child of pioneers who had settled in the Waldo Hills east of Salem. T.T. remembered his father calling in the sheep, the boom of the cannons through the valley when Oregon became a state, the moment, as a young boy, that he first realized his grandfather was his father's father. He found that astonishing, that the fathers of the children he knew themselves have fathers.
How mysterious are the opening years of a child's life anyway? We go back to the very beginnings of memory and recall the things that first made an impression upon it.
T.T. wasn't just curious about the past, but about the present and the future of Oregon as well. New industries like logging were beginning to dominate the landscape, and the political process of a brand new state was being refined. As a young man working on his family farm, he'd often write out his thoughts as articles or essays that he'd send to local publications, at first anonymously. To his surprise, they were printed.
Early in life, I found myself possessed of a liking for newspaper writing, for the pleasure I found in controversies involving the discussion of public questions. Often while plowing, I have thought out the substance of an article for publication, and having constructed and reconstructed a sentence until I was satisfied, have stopped the team and jotted it down on a piece of paper. This process would be repeated many times, late some evening while the family slept.
because he had all day long to figure out what it was he wanted to say and how he was going to say it. And in the evening, he just sat down, wrote it all out, sent it in. And after a while, people started to notice. And they kind of liked what he was saying and how he said it. And finally, they convinced him to run for public office.
T.T. was elected to the Oregon House of Representatives, where he eventually served as Speaker of the House. In 1899, he was elected governor. He moved from his farm in the Waldo Hills to the expanding capital city of Salem and looked out his window onto a landscape transformed. Politicians then catered to the booming industries of the late 1800s, like infrastructure, logging, and agriculture, and grew wealthy making deals in favor of Oregon's big business. It was how politics had run in other parts of the country for years. But T.T. wanted Oregon to operate differently. He passed the First Amendment to Oregon's Constitution, which gave the people the power to recall public officials and adopt laws through popular petitions. It became known nationally as the Oregon System.
I think T.T. was deeply impressed by his grandfather, Joseph Cary Geer, who was renowned for living by the Golden Rule. And that seemed to carry with him all through his career. Even though he had political opponents, I don't believe he ever saw anybody as an enemy. And when people came to him and asked him to do favors or to support certain legislation, his test was always, is this good for the people?
After serving as governor, T.T. became editor of the Oregon Statesman. He'd seen the railroad, mail delivery, and telephone lines introduced to the Waldo Hills. Candles had changed to electric lights. His parents had traveled 6 months over the Oregon Trail, and now he'd gotten news that someone had flown from England to France.
And what shall be the future of this Oregon of ours? It seems that it might be a century since those days in the Waldo Hills when my sister and I played in the log cabin. This is a country of magnificent distances. To be permitted to spend a lifetime in Oregon, one should give thanks through all eternity.
T.T. Geer fought private influence in politics and made waves on a national level. But he wasn't the only one in the family to make waves. His younger cousin Homer Davenport would as well. But his life, back in the Waldo Hills, was off to a rocky and unassuming start.
Until Homer Davenport was 21 years of age, he gave a little promise. He was not given to applying himself steadily to any one thing. To be sure, he had a liking for sketching, but this was held to be a sad and distressing evidence of a general worthlessness. T.T. Geer.
In 1867, Florinda Geer, who had crossed the Oregon Trail with her parents as a child, gave birth to a son in the Waldo Hills. She and her husband, Timothy Davenport, named him Homer. His mother had no interest in him making a living off the land, as most pioneer families did. In fact, she envisioned a very particular future for Homer.
From the point in time in which he was born, Florinda had an ambition for him to become an artist, and not just any artist, but a political cartoonist. As soon as Homer was able to hold a pencil in his hand, Florinda had him doing drawings.
To Florinda's delight, Homer was drawing horses and birds almost before he could walk. But when he was just 3.5 years old, she contracted smallpox and died. Florinda asked her husband to be faithful to her vision for her son and raise him as an artist.
When she was sitting on her deathbed, she made Father Davenport promise that Homer wouldn't have to do anything that he didn't want to do, just so long as he had a chance to practice his drawing. And he made that promise.
The Davenports moved to the expanding town of Silverton, 7 miles away. Homer grew up there, and as per his father's promise to his mother, he was never asked to do the work that the other boys did, putting up hay or the harvest. All he was required to do was continue his training in art, which, for the son of pioneers who had trudged over 2,000 miles to arrive in fertile Oregon, was unique.
He used to go around Silverton, leaving drawings on the buildings and the old covered bridge. He didn't have discipline. He didn't have formal training in art. He was looked at as, I believe, at that time, as somebody without any real future.
He was an umpire in baseball. He was a clown in the circus.
Had a dog that he taught tricks and took to Portland to make money.
No, he wasn't very good at anything, and nobody expected him to make much of his life. And he didn't until he left Silverton.
His father came to him when he was around 20 or so and said, I think it's time that you took your art to the next level and got a job.
His father reached out to a cousin at the Associated Press, and he got Homer a job at the San Francisco Examiner at $5 a week. That was barely enough for room and board, even in 1891. And on top of that, the art editor would hang Homer's drawings up in the office with notes like, "This is how we don't do it." His cousin Geer talked with him during that time and remembered that he told some stories of himself that let you see he wasn't being treated very nicely. The people he worked with, the other artists, still regarded him as a country boy.
At first, Davenport's genius was unrecognized. His opportunity came when a famous horse died. There was no picture of him in the Examiner office. Davenport loved horses, and he had seen the animal 1 year before. He drew the horse from memory. Mrs. Fremont Older.
Homer had been drawing horses since he was 3 years old in the Waldo Hills, and the accuracy of his illustration surprised not just the owner of the horse, but the owner of the Examiner, William Randolph Hearst. He saw something special in the young artist from Oregon. Homer's photographic memory became useful for drawing politicians that tried to stay out of the public eye. And just as his mother once imagined, he became the Examiner's political cartoonist.
Hearst had, in those days, had political ambitions. He had the San Francisco paper, but he needed a paper on the East Coast. So he went back to Manhattan and he bought there the smallest circulating paper he could find. And he sent to San Francisco for 3 people to help start that paper. He sent for his editor, he sent for his advice columnist, and he sent for Homer Davenport. And in 2 years, building on that core of people, William Randolph Hearst took that paper to the widest circulating paper in New York. And Homer Davenport's political cartoons were being seen all over America.
William Randolph Hearst established a coast-to-coast newspaper empire, and Homer Davenport's cartoons were seen each day by millions of people. Homer, who still referred to himself as a country boy, had become an indispensable part of American culture and politics.
He did a lot of his early drawings on pieces of the pine boxes that they used to ship dry goods. And his father actually owned a store for a while, and so I think that's where he must have gotten a lot of the materials, because a lot of his drawings were on these panels, these wood panels.
Lori Erickson, a curator at the Oregon Historical Society, is getting ready to premiere a new exhibit of Oregon cartoonists featuring Homer Davenport.
The thing about political cartoons is they have such a wide reach that, anyone can understand them. In the past, there weren't as many ways of getting information out to people. There were newspapers and magazines. You couldn't instantly communicate with the internet like we can now. So this was one of the ways that people could really sway public opinion and really call attention to injustices. And so he was one of the most successful cartoonists in Oregon of all time. And I think it's really going to be wonderful to introduce him to new generations of people that may not have heard of him and may not realize that we had this amazing talent living here, and how much he affected the world.
Being sort of an innocent kid from the country and carrying that innocence with him into metropolitan cultures, I think endeared him to many people he met in his life. He was a genuine young man. And when he had occasion to come back to Silverton, which was always his goal, he was always homesick for Silverton, he was met by the population with accolades there. And he had become their hometown hero.